welcome to the Ohio Resource Center's Science Instructional Strategies, a look at the OGT webcast, and more specifically, so your students are not where they are supposed to be. I'm Terry Shiverdecker, Science Content Specialist for the Ohio Resource Center for Mathematics, Science, and Reading. Today we will be discussing the importance of the verbs in the benchmarks and grade level indicators, vertical alignment, and strategies for helping underprepared students get ready for the OGT. This program is one of a series of 5 webcasts dealing with science instructional strategies and the OGT. But before we begin, I'd like to draw your attention to the features located on the webcast interface. You may have noticed the Submit a Question button to the right side of the screen. Submit your question at any time and we'll answer as many as we can at the end of the live program. Also, in the lower half of the screen, you'll find support materials related to our topic today. These materials include the So Your Students Are Not Where They Are Supposed to Be article, several mini collections. These items can be accessed at any point during the webcast and will continue to be available, as well as information about other webcasts in this series on the Science Instructional Strategies, a look at the OGT webpage. And that URL is ohioRC.org/4/science/OGT. Now I'd like to introduce our 2 panelists joining us for today's discussion, Cindy Repke and Chris Mansour. Cindy is the K-12 Science Curriculum Coordinator for the Pickerington Local Schools. She taught high school chemistry and is the 2007 President of the Science Education Council of Ohio. Cindy is serving as the Program Coordinator for the 2008 NSTA Area Conference in Cincinnati. Cindy has participated in many state initiatives such as the OSI Professional Development Program and IMS Lesson Writing. Chris is a biology teacher and department chair at Tiffin Columbian High School. He also teaches biology courses at Terra Community College. Chris has studied biology and inquiry through expeditions in Africa, Trinidad, and Argentina, and participated in the Teacher at Sea program last summer. Chris was named 2005 Ohio Biology Teacher of the Year. Both Chris and Cindy participated in the development of the Program Model Instructional Support for Educators, or PROMIS, Pacing Guides and Inquiry Challenges. They also serve on the ORC Science Review Board. Chris, Cindy, welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, let's get started by discussing the article and paying attention to the verbs. The article discusses the importance of paying attention to the verbs in the standards. Cindy, can you give us some examples of how the verbs can help us gain some insight into the depth of understanding students should have of a particular topic at the end of each grade band?
Well, I think paying attention to the verbs is critical. Most of us in our school districts have done a pretty good job of aligning our curriculum at this point, but paying attention to the verbs is that little bit more subtle piece that we're still trying to work on. So we've started by selecting a couple of earth science examples to kind of investigate this use of the verbs. And the 2 benchmarks I'm going to refer to are Earth Science benchmarks, Benchmark B, or Benchmark C for grades 6 through 8, which says describe the interactions of matter and energy throughout the lithosphere, hydrosphere, and atmosphere. But then when you get to Benchmark B in grades 9 through 10, the kind of corollary benchmark, it's explained that many processes occur in patterns within the Earth systems. And the verbs change from describe in 6 through 8 to explain in 9 and 10. By looking at a recently released OGT question, this is question number 17 from the March 2005 administration, you see the graphic is on your screen of your webcast. This is a graph of precipitation versus temperature, and about 6 American biomes are illustrated in this particular graph. And the question reads that biome Z would likely be found in which of these locations, and 2 of them are identified by name on the graphic, the temperate forests and the coniferous forests. The 4 choices for this question were that biome Z would be in a valley along the Pacific coast, biome Z would be along a rocky shore in New England, biome Z would be in the middle of the Midwestern Plains, or biome Z would be above the tree line in the Rocky Mountains. And the correct answer for this particular question was letter D, above the tree line in the Rocky Mountains, because this is the biome that would most likely have a low temperature and a fairly low annual precipitation. Only 49% of the students in 2005 got this particular question correct. This question is a good illustration of that verb explain, because even though this is a multiple choice question, the students had to use that skill set of explanation in order to correctly identify the right response.
So even though many of the questions on the OGT are multiple choice questions, students still need to think at a little bit higher level. They need to do some reasoning, and paying attention to those verbs in the benchmarks helps us prepare students to think at that level, even for multiple choice questions.
Right. So in this particular instance, they had to very carefully analyze that graph and think about the different situations for biomes that were referred to in this particular graph to reason through that answer.
Yeah, that's a great example. Chris, could you give us an example of one of the process standards?
Yeah, the process standards are those standards that seem to be kind of more difficult for teachers to kind of get their heads around, the sciences inquiry, scientific ways of knowing. Two that I kind of picked out that I think are important for a teacher getting a student ready for the OAT or for the OGT is Benchmark A, Scientific Inquiry Benchmark A, grades 6 through 8, and Scientific Inquiry Benchmark A, grades 9 through 10. The 6 through 8 benchmark uses the word explain, whereas it actually says explain that there are different sets of procedures for guiding investigation. And benchmark 910A, participate in and apply the process. I think the key is the two words, one is saying explain and one is saying participate. Explain, you want to stimulate your students' thinking. You may give them an example of an experiment, have them go through and pick it apart, try to have them find evidence, create new concepts, maybe question one another for explaining, seeing what that person did in that particular experiment. Whereas if you go to a participate or apply at the 9th and 10th grade level, the students are creating their own investigation. They're posing their own question. They're planning the procedure. They're creating the results, or they're collecting the data, to form the results. Your learners should be engaged. And so as a 10th grade teacher like myself, when I'm trying to hit that inquiry benchmark, I'm trying to have my students develop their own experiences. And I think that's key, is that you want to give priority to evidence, and you want them to formulate the experience. Because going from explain to participate, you're going to a higher level of rigor. And so now here's the catch. Inquiry. And as a teacher, my first couple years teaching, inquiry, wasn't quite sure what it meant, thought it was this long drawn out process. I'm letting the kids run free, which is not really what it is. And so I think for a teacher to maybe introduce inquiry into their classroom, they can do a couple easy things. Doing a pre-lab assessment, giving them a point of reference. Sometimes what I'll do is do a lab first, or inquiry lab first. An example is if you're learning about respiration, give the students some vials of bromethyl blue indicator, have them blow into the straw, see the change, and then maybe have them run in place and do it again, just to kind of get them thinking about, okay, why did this happen? They might not necessarily have every concept for respiration down, but at least they can say, oh, something's happening there. Revising materials, sometimes I'll throw in a part into the procedure where I'll say, find my mistake. So inquiry is not necessarily this thing you have to rush headlong into. You can gradually ease into it, but you really do got to train your students to do it, because you are having them thinking outside the box. So, and you want to try to get away from that cookbook method of, you get the new books, they've got the lab manual about this thick, and it's cookbook procedure, this is what they need to do, here's the data tables.
Yeah, you mentioned those cookbook labs, Chris. Those, and you're talking about the ones where the protocol is laid out, and as you said, that the student really doesn't have to think a lot about how I'm going to answer the question that's been posed, and also doing those short inquiry investigations before you go headlong into the topic as a way to kind of hook the kids and get them interested in studying the topic.
Yeah, because even with some of those cookbook lessons, labs, the students wouldn't really necessarily need to do the lab to answer the questions. There's background information, this is what you do, find the answer, whereas with an inquiry, you kind of let them take control and let them come up with the inquiry. But also, it's also, you know, like one little simple thing you can do with a cookbook lab to turn it into an inquiry is you take the procedure part, cut it up into little slips, get rid of the numbers, and mix them up and have them try to piece it together. So there are little simple things that teachers can do out there to kind of make their classroom a little more inquiry before they rush headlong into it.
Okay, great. Chris, I'd like to stick with you for a minute and draw on your content expertise as a biology teacher. Can you give me an example of the vertical alignment of a life science topic and follow that with some strategies you might use if the students come to you underprepared?
Yes, the topic that I find most problems with is sexual asexual reproduction and then tying that into alleles and genes. The benchmarks for 6 or 8 benchmark would be life science would be B, 6-8B, describe the characteristics of an organism in terms of inherited traits and reproduction. And then 9 through 10C would be explain the genetic mechanism and molecular basis of inheritance. The picture you have on your screen on the web now, this was a question that was asked this year's for the 8th grade OAT. It gives you a picture, the question being paramecium usually reproduce asexually, fish reproduce sexually, supposing environmental conditions, lagoon change. If your students do not know the difference between sexual and asexual reproduction, it may be difficult for them to answer this question. The question goes on to further say, you know, the stem is, what advantage will the fish population have over the paramecium? A, sexual reproduction produces offspring that are identical to the parent. Well, if a student doesn't necessarily know the definition of sexual asexual, they might say, well, yeah, it's going to look identical to the parent. So there's a misconception there. B, sexual reproduction decreases the genetic variability. Again, if the students have that knowledge of asexual and sexual, they'll know that it doesn't decrease the genetic variability, it actually will increase it. Sexual reproduction limits the spread of harmful characteristics. Again, not necessarily the best answer there because it can actually pass on genetic or harmful characteristics. 60% did answer this one correct with letter D, sexual reproduction allows populations to adapt to new conditions over fewer generations. So without knowing sexual and asexual reproduction, this question would have been difficult. Then moving into the vertical alignment piece at the 9th and 10th grade, if they don't understand the difference between sexual and asexual, and you start throwing in genes and alleles, so this piece here, this particular question would probably be good a pre-assessment piece to give to your students to see if they know the difference between sexual and asexual reproduction, because you can move into some of the common misconceptions I've seen as a 10th grade science teacher. Is, you know, a lot of my students understand that plants do produce sexually. They think that pollen, or whatever it is, sometimes I don't even know, it just becomes a new plant. That asexual reproduction results in weakness, when in actuality, asexual reproduction may cause the organism a better chance to survive. An example right now is MRSA and the staph infections. That's an asexually reproducing organism, and it's not very weak, but it's actually a much virulent or much, it's becoming more deadly, so to speak, because it has this asexual reproduction passing on the traits. So the vertical alignment's important, the pre-assessment's important. I think using these OAT as pre-assessments will help with that vertical alignment piece.
Okay, very good. Cindy, can you give us an example of a topic in the physical sciences and some strategies?
Well, in physical science, one of the areas that has been classically determined as a topic that students struggle with has been that with forces in motion. And here again, I think this vertical alignment is a useful strategy for teachers, because this way a teacher has a good understanding of what students have been exposed to in the past, what they already should know, and then where are we going from there. And this idea of using 8th grade or release test items as pre-assessment tools is very useful for that same purpose. So on your screen is a NAEP item, and in this particular instance, I'll describe the stem of the question for you. 2 boys wearing inline skates are standing on a smooth surface with the palms of their hands touching and their arms bent, as shown in the picture. If boy X pushes by straightening out his arms while boy Y holds his arms in the original position, what is the motion of the 2 boys? And there are 3 very good distractors, but the correct answer is that both boy X and boy Y will move backwards. But only 45% of the students across the nation, this was a NAEP item, were able to answer this question correctly. More recently, on the 8th grade Ohio Achievement Test, we have an example of another question. This was a toy car race, and you can see on this particular question that we have a diagram, we have a starting block, we have a ramp, we have a finish line. And there's also a lot of rich data that comes with this particular question. You'll notice on the next screen that there's speed and distance data, and there's also a graph. So when you read the question, this is question number 31 on the 8th grade test, on what section of the racetrack will the forces on the cars be balanced? And the 4 choices are the starting block, the ramp, the level section after the ramp, or the entire track. And in this particular question, 54% of the students were able to answer this question correctly as choice A, the starting block. What I'd like to point out with these 2 different released items is that they would be very good pre-assessment questions because they relate to the 6th through 8th grade band benchmarks and 9 through 10 benchmarks. In 6 through 8, in simple cases, describe the motion of objects and conceptually describe the effects of forces on the object. Notice that students really didn't have to do any mathematical calculations in this particular instance. They didn't really have to cite Newton's laws of motion, but they were asked to describe the effects of motion conceptually. But in grades 9 through 10, the benchmark changes to explain the movement of objects by applying Newton's 3 laws of motion. So you would use these as pre-assessments to see whether the kids are where they're supposed to be, and then you would design instructional episodes for them to bring them up to the level that you would want. One of the nice features of the Ohio Resource Center is there's a vast collection of lessons and experiences that have been already annotated and collected for you as a classroom teacher to select from and peer reviewed. So we've kind of selected 2 to suggest to you that would be good instructional experiences for the students related to this particular benchmark. And both of the Ohio RC number 424, which is exploring pendulums lesson, and also the Ohio Resource Center number 450, it's a crash test dummy, are both excellent lessons that would provide opportunities for students to further develop their concepts based on forces in motion.
Cindy, can you help me remember the exploring pendulums? Is there a technology piece with that, or is it just a hands-on, minds-on piece, or?
It's a combination of both. It really is excellent for getting into the process skills, as Chris cited earlier, because you can vary the length of the pendulum, you can vary the mass of the bob, you can vary the starting point of the pendulum, but also it has a nice online assessment in which the question is what would happen to the pendulum if you took it to the surface of the moon. And that's a good question for students, and then they're able to investigate this online as an interactive assessment.
That's great. And that question too then asks them to apply what they know to kind of a unique situation,
yes,
which always really tests their knowledge a little bit.
Right.
Both of you have mentioned pre-assessment, which we know is just a critical piece to finding out where our students are. Cindy, can you suggest some additional strategies for using released OAT items for pre-assessment?
Well, I think one of the features to all of the state assessments is this use of clusters of questions, where there's some kind of an embedded, it's a visual or a paragraph that the students have to read, description of an experiment, maybe it's a set of data charts or graphs, and we've looked at a couple of them already. But on the release test for the 8th grade OAT, there was a series of questions on density, and these were questions 3 through 6. And in this series of questions, there were 3 short answer questions, all related to this particular diagram, and explaining a density experiment that was done where a student measured the mass of 2 metal balls, and one of them is identified as being aluminum, the other one is identified as being lead. And then a series of questions that went along with this, and you can see from the graphic that both of them have the same volume. So one of the questions was an inference question, again back to our science process skills and how important those are, that we include them and embed them in our instruction throughout our content. In this particular question, the mass of the lead ball is listed as 113 grams, and the mass of the aluminum ball is 27 grams, or measured at. And the 4 questions are: the density of both metal balls is the same, or the density of both metal balls is less than the density of the water, or the density of the lead ball is less than the density of the aluminum ball, or the density of the lead ball is greater than the density of the aluminum ball. And in this particular question, the correct choice was D, that the lead ball's density was greater than the aluminum ball, and 70% of our students were able to answer that question correctly, which would suggest that there's some good instruction that has led up to that particular item, and I can move forward in terms of that understanding of density when I go as a high school teacher to instruct on that particular concept. In this cluster, there's also a very nice short answer question in which the student accidentally dropped the lead ball and it changed its shape from a sphere to an egg-shaped solid. And the student was asked to predict what effect, if any, this change had on the amount of water displaced by the lead ball. So this one is one where not only do I get my pre-assessment by choosing a multiple choice question, but I can also have a writing sample from my students, and I can see how they can respond to that explain. In this particular instance, the benchmark was relate uses of. So I'm back to my verbs again.
And if I can jump in about writing for science, I think that is key for these tests. There are short answer, extended response, and using OAT, you can use these as a pre-assessment. Can you also use them to help, to teach your students to write for science, and have, give them this, particular question, and then have them write about it. And I know an important thing on the OGT is to refer back to data. Mm-hmm. And when you're teaching your students to write for science, to refer back to the data, because data is the key. And so if you can get your students in the habit of, when they are writing for science, refer back to the data, they'll have that much better chance of getting, 2 points or 3 or the 4, depending on the type of question. And so I think these OATs can be used also, not just maybe pre-assessment of the content, but pre-assessment of writing for science.
Yeah, let's follow up on that a little bit. And I did want to clarify there, for this cluster, it's the same stimulus, and there are 3 multiple choice questions and 1 short answer.
Yes.
Okay, how did students do on the short answer?
It varied with the question, 1 question. In this same cluster, students only were able to answer it correctly for only 20% of only 20% of the students were able to answer the question correctly, and yet the one I shared with you a moment ago, 70% of the students were able to answer that question correctly. On this particular short answer question, this is a critical aspect of student performance on any of the state assessment, OGT, OAT, in that only 57% of the students 57% of students, excuse me, I was saying that incorrectly, 57% of students scored 0 points, not because they didn't respond to it, but because they responded inappropriately to the question in terms of the science content. So they didn't get any points at all. So 43% of the students got either 1 or 2 points on this particular question.
And that can also go back to using those verbs of explain or describe or apply. They may have attempted to answer the question, but they didn't answer it properly because they may not have been aware of what to do. What does it mean to explain or apply? So, yeah, that 57% is definitely a high percent that
were unsuccessful.
Unsuccessful.
Yeah, so if we've got 50% of students questioned who have responded incorrectly or didn't attempt a response, How do we go about helping them being comfortable with writing and expressing what they know in a written form? Can you describe some strategies that might help students, particularly students who are underprepared, be a little bit better prepared for the OGT and express their understanding of science?
I think the key is when you have them write in class, that's not necessarily going to be for a grade. I think that's the first thing. If you take some of the fear that, if I don't cross all my T's or dot my I's, that I'm going to lose points. But I think the key is you want them to write and try to get them to get, you might have students come to you that may not be writing at grade level. And so you have to bring them up, but try to get, just to write, to be able to see if they can express their thoughts. Can they refer back to data? I think that's helpful. And the more that you write, the easier it'll get. They might fight you at first. Believe me, I know. But it's kind of a gradual process, and then it'll just become part of the norm because, this is science, we're not supposed to write. And so I think that whole misconception needs to be overcame.
And in many questions, at least for an OGT style question, there's a specific task that they need to do. So getting the kids to identify what those tasks were. For instance, in this particular question, it was predict what effect and then explain your prediction. And of course, they needed to use appropriate scientific terminology that when the ball changed shape, it was just a physical change in this particular instance. They had to explain it. And so getting the kids to realize that there are two parts to this question. I can't just dance all over the place. And I think coming up with strategies so that the student who doesn't feel comfortable writing incomplete sentences recognizes that it's getting the information on the paper, not necessarily there has to be dotting the I's, crossing the T's, period follows the sentence to get full credit for a question.
Or even like creating concept maps or just stuff to kind of get them to think about what they're supposed to be doing. And again, going back to the verbs prediction, if they don't know what prediction means, and if they just explain, they're not going to get the points that was awarded towards the prediction part.
So we want to set a non-threatening environment for them to practice writing, and then ramp the skills up over time, and always paying attention to what exactly is it you're being asked here. Okay, very good. I know one of the concerns that teachers have is a very common concern for teachers is providing appropriate instruction for students with disabilities. What are some strategies to help these students?
I know in my classroom I do work with some students that do have some problems with vocabulary is the big one, and so I'll do things like a word wall, concept maps, concept webs, graphic organizers. Those seem to work out well to work on the vocabulary, because I think the vocabulary is key first, and then you can go from there. And also, just kind of cutting to the chase, kind of focusing in on, okay, what do we need to know first, and then building from there. Instead of giving them a bunch of general information, giving them the specific, and then building out from there, I think is helpful, at least working with some of my students.
I think kind of going along with what Chris just said, chunking the information, not necessarily giving them everything all at once. Maybe being very thoughtful about the sequence that you use when you're presenting the information. I'd like to go back to the forces in motion example, where the content standards do a very nice job of laying out, let's talk about frame of reference, then let's talk about describing motion, then let's talk about the forces that are impacting that motion of that object, and almost providing a sequence of instruction that maybe helps students build on a concept instead of just throwing it out to them all at one time.
Yeah, so really thinking about how one piece of knowledge leads to a better understanding of the second piece, and then making connections between what we've already learned and now what's this new thing that we're going to learn. And Chris, you've mentioned the vocabulary piece. We do have our own language in science, and it's really important, I think, and I agree with you 100% on this, for kids to be comfortable with that language and to use it as part of the way they write and talk about science.
And to really understand what a theory is in science as opposed to what it is maybe used in media, because I think what's happened is a lot of these terms have been kind of given different meanings. And so I think it's really important that teachers use the vernacular as it pertains to science, theories and laws. So.
And you can even use that example of a football game in which you're trying to emphasize the scientific difference between distance and displacement, and watching the player run horizontally across the field, ran a long distance, but didn't really go up, make forward progress up the field. So when you're talking about terminology, even relating it to everyday examples.
Yeah, it always helps to tie it back to real world examples. Chris and Cindy, we've received several questions from the audience. So I'd like to go into those and try to answer as many of them as we can in the time that we have left. And this first question plays very nicely on the conversation we just had. I have a very diverse classroom with students who are on many different levels on any given topic. In order to plan instruction to meet the needs of the diverse learners in my classroom, how would you suggest placing these students in small groups in order to get them up to speed?
I think you would want to have a variety of groupings and not necessarily stick with one group all year long. So that sometimes, depending upon the goal of your lesson, that you would want to maybe put your higher end kids together so that they can be pursuing some kind of an enrichment activity. But other times I think there's a lot of merit in mixing the different ability level students together.
The key is knowing your students and differentiating when you kind of using their strengths to maybe help each other out. But I do agree with Cindy, it needs to be, you can't have the same groups the whole time because someone's not going to benefit in the end.
Yeah, so we want to plan how we're putting those students into collaborative groups based upon what our instructional goals are and what the students' particular needs happen to be.
I think we use the terminology flexible grouping.
I like that. That makes a lot of sense. I would like to incorporate writing into my classroom more often. Can you give me some ways to focus on the verbs while also increasing students' writing skills?
I'll let you take that one. I'll let you start.
Well, I think the more writing you can do, the better. Whether it's a free writing, something like a bell ringer at the beginning of the class where you have a question that you've posed on the board and the students come in and they're expected to write for the next several minutes. And you would use these, this is another strategy for pre-assessment, because you would use these thoughtful questions to help gauge where your students are so that you know how to plan future instruction.
And sometimes what I will do is I will provide students with an article, say from Discover magazine or another scientific journal, and have them read it and try to pick out some of the science behind it. I also have metacognitive reading logs where I'll say the most interesting thing I learned was, and they fill it in. I might have them pick out some vocab words, but again, trying to pick articles that they're interested in first. Because if a student's interested and it's connected to their world somehow, they're going to kind of run with it. I'm not going to, give them an abstract or something from maybe the American Medical Association to write about, but something that's interesting and that'll kind of get them thinking about it.
Yeah, draw them in through what they already know and are interested in. Okay, what would be the first strategy you would try if your class was below grade level on a given topic? And a second part to this, does the strategy depend upon the topic?
I think this. I don't think necessarily mean the strategy depends on the topic. I think you can vary strategies. You know your students. You pick the strategy that works best for you. But I think you pre-assess first. I think that's the key. Pre-assessment, because once you know where your students are at, then you can go from there. If you just kind of go headlong into it, full force, and not know, you might end up with some more problems at the end. So.
You don't want to assume you already know where the students are based on what the class was that you had last year or even the class that you had the previous period. So pre-assessment would be a crucial strategy to find out where your students are and then design your instruction for what you've learned from the pre-assessment.
Okay, and that finding out where the kids are, you're right, you can't assume anything. That's a dangerous way to go into it. We have time for one more question, and it's actually a perfect question. It goes right with what we've just been talking about with pre-assessment. What pre-assessment strategy do you prefer and or feel is most effective to determine where students are in their understanding of a topic and why?
One I like to use are the KWL charts for pre-assessment just in general, but you want to try to vary the pre-assessments because you don't want it to get boring. But or the same old thing, but I think the KWL charts are good because you find out what they already know, and then you do get to see what they've learned. Venn diagrams, I'm a big fan of Venn diagrams. That's been my kick for the last couple of weeks, is I put 2 Venn diagrams up, photosynthesis, respiration, and we go through, and that way at least you can clear up misconceptions. Pre-assessments need to be quick. They're not meant to be necessarily graded, and you're just trying to get a baseline.
Any kind of quick and dirty question that gets to the crux of the matter so you can find out what kids already know. Even just having conversations with students. Asking a question at the beginning of the class period, beginning of the unit, what do you know about this topic? And making a list. Find out what they already know. A little bit more informal than a KWL chart maybe, but just having those conversations with students.
And again, in a very non-threatening environment. I said that was going to be the last question, but we just got one that it's a really good question, as all of them have been, but I'd really like for us to address this question and go just a little bit longer. How would you address the critical thinking skills required for many of the questions? Do you purposely address the cognitive skills needed?
I think part of that is going back to how we started this webcast with looking at the verbs. And I believe that one of the things that the standards have done is that they are a paradigm shift from what did I teach as a teacher to what are my students expected to be able to do. So if the grade level indicator says, I know we focus on benchmarks a lot of times for test items, but if the grade level indicator says students should be able to select the appropriate tools to do the lab investigation, many times teachers are already giving the students the tools that they need, not allowing the student that opportunity to participate. You used the word participate earlier in the selection of the tools, or learning about safety, or researching MSDS sheets. And sometimes we use that as a time factor. It takes too long, but we need to remember that this is what the students need to be able to do.
And again, your students are coming to you with some critical thinking skills already, but many times they're not allowed to use them because they sit maybe in a certain class, they get a worksheet to fill in. That's not critical thinking. And so to address those critical thinking skills, you have to provide them the opportunity to do it. And by doing a cookbook lab might not necessarily be providing them the critical thinking skills required. So you have to allow them to do the science.
And that goes back to the inquiry.
Yep.
How important inquiry is in structuring your science opportunities for kids to participate in.
Okay, very good. Well, Chris and Cindy, I'd like to thank you for taking part in our webcast today.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
And I'd also like, I want to give you the opportunity, though. I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to give you the opportunity to make any final points that you might like to make. And then I'm going to thank you again.
I'll let you go first.
Well, I don't know that we've overemphasized this, but again, I think the verbs help give us a lot of the level of depth and understanding that our students need to have at different levels and in terms of the OGT for being able to be successful. So we can follow through with understanding and tweaking our instruction for those verbs.
And I think for science, we can no longer view our students as blank slates that we got to fill with information. They're coming to us with information. We just need to provide experiences for them to build on that, and not trying to, we have to give them the opportunity to experience the science. And I think once we get over that little hump that, we need to force feed this information, just allow them to do the science, I think we'll see a dramatic change in the science that we're not seeing right now.
Okay. Well, and as promised, I'll thank you both again for taking your time this afternoon to share your expertise with other science educators in the state.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you.
And I'd also like to thank you for your participation in email questions. In this webcast, we've discussed the importance of the verbs in the benchmarks and grade level indicators, vertical alignment, and strategies for helping underprepared students get ready for the OGT. We also shared some writing strategies to help students be more successful in science and on the OGT. We've provided a thumbnail sketch of these topics. Don't forget to check the supporting materials available on the Science Instructional Strategies, A Look at the OGT webpage. And you'll find that at www.ohioRC.org/4/Science ORC.org/science/OGT. If you would like to learn more about these topics and work collaboratively with ORC to plan professional development programs for your building or district, contact ORC at web@ohioRC.org. And we'd like to invite you to register and take part in our December 12th webcast using released OGT items in Learning Cycle lessons. For the Ohio Resource Center, I'm Terry Shiverdecker, wishing you success with all of your science instructional strategies.